Adeline Roswell had not spoken above a whisper in the house on Beckridge Lane for 3 years, and no one seemed to notice that her silence had grown teeth. She stood at the edge of the receiving line at the Hartfield Gala, her hand resting light as paper on her husband's arm. And she heard him tell Judge Corwin, in the easy voice men used when they believed a wife was furniture, that marriage had been the sensible course after his father's death, nothing more, a matter of land and name, and that a man in his position couldn't afford sentiment. The judge laughed. Someone's wife laughed. The orchestra kept playing, indifferent, and Adeline kept her spine straight and her face perfectly, terribly calm, because that was the one skill 3 years with Weston Hale had taught her better than any other. How to be struck and not flinch. How to let a thing land in her chest and settle there like a stone dropped into a well too deep to hear it hit water. If you have ever loved someone who spoke of you only in terms of usefulness, you already know how this feels. Stay until the end. This one earns it. The summer had come to Millbrook Ridge, Ohio, in the year 1889, thick and gold and slow, pressing down over the wheat fields the way it always did in late July, turning the air itself into something you had to push through. The Hartfield estate sat at the top of the ridge like it had always belonged. There, white columns catching the last of the evening light, carriages lined up along the gravel drive, for a mile in either direction. Every family with a name worth mentioning in that part of the county had come. It was, everyone agreed, the finest gathering Millbrook Ridge had seen since the railroad extension had been announced. Adeline had not wanted to come. She rarely wanted to go anywhere anymore, not because she disliked people, but because she had learned that a room full of people was, for her, only a more elaborate kind of loneliness. She was 26 years old, and she had been Mrs. Weston Hale for 3 years, and in that time she had perfected the particular art of standing in a crowded room and being looked past. She wore a dress the color of a robin's egg that evening, plain compared to the others, no lace at the collar, because Weston did not care to spend on things he considered decorative. And she had stopped asking. Her only jewelry was a small garnet ring that had belonged to her mother, worn thin at the band, the one thing of her old life she had refused to put away in a drawer. She had been born Adeline Marchetti. No, that wasn't right either, though it was the sort of quiet correction she made to herself constantly now, the way a person keeps checking a wound to see if it has stopped bleeding. She had been born Adeline Foss, the only daughter of a shipping clerk who had died owing more than he owned. And when Weston Hale had come calling 2 months after her father's funeral, everyone in Millbrook Ridge had called it a mercy. A girl with no fortune and no father to speak for her, taken in by the wealthiest man in 3 counties. No one had asked her if she wanted mercy. No one had asked her much of anything. Across the ballroom, Weston stood at the center of a loose ring of men, the way he always did. The way that seemed to happen around him without his ever trying to arrange it. He was 34. Tall in the particular way that made rooms rearrange themselves without his noticing, his dark coat cut close and correct, his jaw set in the expression that had become, over 3 years, entirely familiar to her, not unkind exactly, but closed, the way a door is closed when the man behind it has forgotten there was ever a key. He ran the Hale Mills, the largest employer between Millbrook Ridge and the county seat, and he ran his household with the same unbending arithmetic. Adeline had learned early that Weston did not believe in wasted motion, wasted sentiment, wasted anything. He had married her because a man of his standing needed a wife, and a wife needed to come from somewhere respectable enough not to embarrass him, and she had fit the requirement well enough. He had never pretended otherwise. What she had not expected, what she still 3 years later felt somewhere under her ribs like an old bruise, was how much it would cost her to be told, gently and without cruelty, that she was a line item and not a person. "She's a good manager of the house," she heard him say now, to the men gathered close, his voice carrying just enough for her to catch it from across the room. "Keeps things orderly. That's what a man needs, in the end, not romance. Romance is for novels." The men chuckled, the comfortable chuckle of men who had never once had to wonder whether they were loved. Adeline did not cry. She had cried, in the first year, more nights than she could count, quietly, into a pillow in a room down the hall from her husband's, because Weston kept separate rooms, had kept them from the 2nd month of their marriage, citing his early hours at the mill. She had cried until crying had become, itself, exhausting, and somewhere in the 2nd year she had simply stopped. Not because the hurt had gone, because she had found without meaning to a different use for herself. It had started with Mrs. Abernathy, the housekeeper, who was 71 and half blind in one eye, and terrified of losing her position, and to whom Adeline had begun, quietly, teaching her letters back over, so the old woman's eyesight wouldn't be the thing that undid 30 years of service. It had grown from there. The tenant families on the Hale land, and there were nearly 40 of them, farming plots that Weston's father had parceled out a generation before, came to know that if a child was sick, or a roof had gone soft with rot, or a widow needed someone to write a letter to a son gone west, it was Mrs. Hale who would come, quietly, in a plain dress, with a basket and a steady hand, and never once mention it to her husband. She had found, in the space her marriage had left empty, an entire life that belonged only to her. It was in that life that she had first truly spoken to Micah Sinclair. He had come to Millbrook Ridge the autumn after her wedding, hired to oversee repairs on the tenant cottages, a carpenter by trade with quiet hands, and a way of listening that she had never once experienced from her own husband. He was not handsome in the way Weston was handsome. No one turned to look at him when he entered a room. But he had a way of tilting his head when someone spoke, as if what they were saying mattered enough to be heard all the way through, and Adeline had found herself, over the better part of 2 years, telling him things she had never told anyone, not confessions, not anything a court would call improper. Just the ordinary truths of her days, that she missed her father's voice, that she had wanted, once, to study botany before her father's debts made wanting anything feel like a luxury she couldn't afford, that she sometimes stood in the orchard behind the house and felt, for exactly as long as she stood there, entirely herself. Micah never once suggested anything untoward. He simply listened, and fixed the roof beams, and once, in the second spring, brought her a pressed fir from the riverbank, because she had mentioned, in passing, that she missed things that grew. She had not told Weston about any of it, not because there was anything to hide, but because she had learned, with a certainty that had settled into her bones, that her husband would not care to know. He had never asked what she did with her days. He had never asked what she thought about anything at all, which was why, 3 days before the Hartfield Gala, everything had changed with a single sentence spoken in an empty hallway. Weston had come home earlier than usual, his boots still dusty from the mill road, and he had found her in the study, at the old writing desk that had been her father's, going through a stack of correspondence from the tenant families. Requests, mostly, small and practical, a broken churn, a debt to a feed merchant, a girl who needed shoes for winter. He had stood in the doorway a long moment before she noticed him. "You've been going to the Coopers," he said, not a question. "Their roof failed in the last storm," she said. "Micah's been repairing it. I thought someone should see the children had enough to eat while the work was being done." Something moved across his face then, something she had not seen in 3 years of marriage, and could not immediately name. "How long has this been going on?" "The roof repairs." "Since Tuesday." "You know what I'm asking." She had looked at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in a long while, and she had found, to her own surprise, that she was not afraid. "I've been caring for people on this land who needed caring for," she said. "Since you have never once asked me to spend my days any particular way, I assumed you did not mind how I spent them." He had said nothing further. He had turned and gone to his study and closed the door, and the silence that followed had lasted 3 full days. And it was into that silence that they had ridden together to the Hartfield Gala, side by side in the carriage, not speaking, because appearances required them to arrive together even when nothing else required anything of them at all. Now, standing at the edge of that glittering room, hearing her husband describe her to strangers as a good manager of a house, Adeline understood something had shifted in her that she could not undo. Not fury exactly, something quieter and more permanent, a door closing on her own side for once. She set down her untouched glass of punch on a passing tray, and she walked out onto the gallery that ran along the west side of the Hartfield house, where the night air was cooler and the noise of the party thinned to a murmur behind glass doors. And she stood at the railing and looked out at the dark shapes of the hills and did not cry, because she had already decided, somewhere in the last 3 days, that she was finished crying over a man who had never once asked to see inside her. She did not hear him come out until he was beside her. "You left the room," Weston said. "I needed air. People noticed, did they?" she said, and there was something in her voice she had not let herself use with him before. Not quite defiance, but its calm, unhurried cousin. "I imagine they'll survive the disappointment." He was quiet a moment. In the light spilling from the ballroom windows, she could see the line of his jaw, the same closed expression, but something else beneath it now, something almost like uncertainty, which she had never once seen on him in 3 years. "I said nothing to Corwin that wasn't true," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "That's rather the trouble with it." She left him standing on the gallery and went to find the carriage. and she rode home alone, because he did not follow, and by the time he returned near midnight, smelling of cigars and other men's opinions, she was already in her own room with the door closed. And for the first time in 3 years the closed door was hers. The following week, Adeline did something she had never done in the whole of her marriage. She went to see Judge Corwin's wife, Mrs. Corwin, who managed the county's small orphan asylum, and had, on more than one occasion, mentioned that she could use a woman of good sense and steady hands to help oversee its accounts and its children. Adeline offered her services 3 days a week, and Mrs. Corwin, delighted, accepted at once, and did not think to ask whether Mr. Hale had given his blessing, because it did not occur to her that a wife might need such a thing, and it did not occur to Adeline to seek it. She did not tell Weston where she went on those 3 days. He did not ask. It was in the 4th week of this arrangement that Weston Hale learned, from his own overseer and not from his wife, that Adeline had been seen at the asylum with the Corwin children gathered around her skirts, laughing. Actually laughing, a sound the overseer said he did not think he had heard from Mrs. Hale in all the years he had known the household, and something in Weston Hale, upon hearing this second-hand report of his own wife's laughter, felt exactly like a man discovering, too late, that a house he had assumed empty had been occupied all along. He rode out to the asylum himself the following Tuesday, though he told no one why, and stood outside the fence for the better part of 10 minutes before he made himself walk in. And there he found Adeline sitting on the porch steps with 3 children clustered close, reading aloud from a battered storybook in a voice he did not recognize, warm, unguarded, entirely without the careful flatness she used at home. She saw him before he spoke, and the warmth in her face closed over, not into fear, but into that same terrible calm she had worn at the Hartfield Gala, and Weston understood, standing there in the dust of the asylum yard, that he had done that. He had taught his own wife to hide her joy from him the way other people hide grief. "I didn't expect you," she said. "Clearly," he said, and he heard, even as he said it, how it sounded, an accusation dressed as an observation which was, he was beginning to realize, the only voice he had ever used with her. He did not stay long. He rode home slower than he had ridden out, and that night, for the first time in 3 years, he did not go straight to his study after supper. He sat instead in the parlor in the chair across from where Adeline sat mending a torn hem, and he said nothing for a long while, and then he said, "I heard you laughing today, at the asylum." She looked up, wary. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said, and the word came out rougher than he intended. "I don't believe I've heard it before. Not in 3 years. She held his gaze a moment, and something passed over her face that he could not read. Not forgiveness, nothing so easy as that, but something like the recognition of a stranger she had once known. "You've never asked to hear it," she said. "I stopped offering what wasn't wanted." She went back to her mending. He sat a long while longer, in a silence that was, for the first time, not comfortable to him, and when he finally rose to go to bed, he found himself standing outside her door instead of his own, though he did not knock, and after a moment he went on to his own room, and lay awake long past when the house had gone dark, turning over, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the shape of what he might have lost, without ever noticing it, had been his to lose. The scandal, when it came, arrived from an entirely unexpected direction, and arrived in September, 3 weeks after the county fair, in the form of Weston's own mother. Judith Hale had never approved of her son's marriage. Not because Adeline lacked breeding enough to satisfy her, though she had made that argument loudly enough in the early days, but because Judith Hale did not approve, on principle, of any woman who might one day command more of her son's attention than she herself did. She had watched, these 3 years, with something between satisfaction and boredom, as her son kept his marriage at the careful, businesslike distance she considered proper. She had not anticipated that her son's marriage might change shape without her permission, and when she began to hear whispers, from Mrs. Corwin's circle, from the mill overseer's wife, from half a dozen sources that all seemed, suddenly, to be discussing Adeline Hale's afternoons at the asylum, her friendship with a carpenter, her laughter, Judith Hale decided the matter required intervention. She came to Beckridge Lane on a Thursday afternoon when she knew Weston to be at the mill, and she found Adeline in the garden, and she did not trouble herself with pleasantries. "People are talking," Judith said, "about you and that carpenter." Adeline set down her trowel slowly, and something in her, the same something that had spoken to Weston on the gallery, the same something that had grown, unnoticed, over 3 years of small quiet acts of care, rose up now, steady and unhurried. "Let them talk," she said. "There is nothing in it for them to find, and I am tired, Judith, of arranging my whole life around what might be said of it. You'll ruin him." Judith said. You'll ruin the Hale name. The Hale name, Adeline said, has survived a great deal worse than a woman being kind to children who have no mothers of their own. If it cannot survive that, it was never as sturdy as your son believes. Judith left in a fury that afternoon, and went straight to her son at the mill, and told him, with considerable embellishment, though Weston did not learn the extent of it until much later, that his wife had made herself a subject of gossip across the whole county, that she had disgraced him with a common tradesman, that he must act at once or lose whatever standing his father had built. Weston came home that evening in a temper he had not permitted himself in years, and found Adeline in the study once more, at her father's old desk, and the argument that followed was the first true argument of their marriage. 3 years of silence breaking open all at once, both of them saying things that had waited far too long to be said. He accused her of shaming him. She told him, in a voice gone hard and clear, that she had spent 3 years being told she was nothing more than a manager of his household, and that if caring for children with no mother, and repairing an old woman's failing eyes, and finding, at last, a single friend who listened to her without judgment, counted as shame in his eyes, then his eyes had never once been capable of seeing her clearly at all. "Do you love him?" Weston demanded. The carpenter, and Adeline, who had asked herself that very question more nights than she would admit, found she could answer it now with a truth that surprised even her. "No," she said. "I don't. But he has been kinder to me in 2 years than you have managed in 3, and if that shames you, Weston, the shame is entirely yours to keep." He had no answer for that. He stood in the doorway of the study a long moment, and then he left the house altogether, and rode out into the dark, and did not come back until well past dawn. He rode, that night, all the way to the ridge above the mill, where he could see the whole of Millbrook Ridge laid out beneath him in the moonlight. The fields his father had parceled to tenant families. The asylum, where his wife's laughter had startled him into something like grief. The house on Beckridge Lane, where he had spent 3 years, training a good woman to hide everything worth loving about herself. He thought of his own father, who had run the mill and the household with the same iron economy Weston had inherited without question, who had never once, in Weston's memory, told his own wife a kind word, and who had died, in the end, attended by servants and lawyers, and no one who wept for him beyond obligation. Weston had thought, all his life, that this was simply what strength looked like. Sitting alone on that ridge in the cold hour before sunrise, he understood, with the particular clarity that only comes too late, that it was not strength at all. It was only fear, dressed up carefully enough that no one, least of all the man wearing it, had ever thought to call it by its name. He came home at first light, and did not go to the mill. He found Adeline in the kitchen garden again, and this time he did not stand at a distance. He knelt instead in the dirt beside her, ruining a pair of trousers his mother would have been horrified to see ruined, and he said, "I have spent 3 years telling myself that what I gave you was enough, because it was more than most men give. A house, a name, security. I never once asked myself whether it was enough for you, because I did not think a wife required anything more than that. I was wrong. I have been wrong since the day I married you, and I did not have the courage to see it until I nearly lost the chance to say so." Adeline did not answer at once. She had waited 3 years for a version of this moment, and had long since stopped expecting it to come, and now that it had come, she found she did not trust it easily. And she told him so, plainly, the way she had learned to tell him everything plainly, now that she had stopped protecting him from her own truths. "I don't know if an apology changes 3 years, she said. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't. I'm not asking it to. I'm asking for the chance to spend the next 3 trying to earn something I never once thought to ask for." It was not resolved in that garden, not fully, not in a single morning. Adeline was too honest with herself to believe that any 2 people could undo 3 years of silence over one confession, however sincerely meant. But something had opened between them that had been sealed shut since the week they married, and over the months that followed, in small and unremarkable ways, Weston Hale began, haltingly, to become a man who asked questions of his wife instead of assumptions about her. The following spring, the county held its annual harvest ball at the Hartfield estate once more, and Weston Hale stood before the same gathered men who had heard him call his marriage a matter of practicality the year before. And this time he raised his glass and spoke of his wife, not as a manager of his household, but as the reason 40 tenant families on Hale land had roofs that did not leak, and children who had learned their letters, and he said, in a voice that carried the length of the ballroom, that he had spent 3 years failing to see the finest thing that had ever come into his life, and that he counted himself the most fortunate man in the county, now that he finally had. Judith Hale, seated near the back with her mouth set in a thin, unhappy line, said nothing at all, though those close to her noticed, for the first time in years, something that might almost have been shame crossing her face. Adeline stood at the center of the room this time, not at its edge, and when Weston crossed to her and took her hand in front of everyone who had once heard him call her nothing more than useful, she did not flinch away from the attention the way the old Adeline might have. She simply looked at him, steady and clear-eyed, and let herself, for the first time in 3 years, be seen. Later that night, on the same gallery where she had once stood alone, in the dark deciding she was finished waiting to matter, Weston found her again, and this time he did not ask why she had left the room. "I used to think," he said quietly, "that the measure of a man was how little he needed anyone, and now I think it's how honestly he lets himself be known by the one person he chose to spend his life with. I chose badly for a long time, Adeline, not in choosing you, in choosing never to know you." She turned to face him fully, and in the light spilling out from the ballroom windows, she let him see, without guarding it, everything that had been waiting 3 long years to be looked at. "Then know me now," she said. "There's still time." And out past the gallery railing, the hills of Millbrook Ridge lay dark and quiet under a sky gone soft with early summer stars, and the house on Beckridge Lane waited at the end of its long gravel drive, its windows lit warm against the dark. No longer a place where a woman practiced the art of being invisible, but a place, finally, that had learned how to hold two people who had chosen, at last, to be truly seen by one another.